So I'm Janneke Jobsis Brown, and I wrote Following Shadows, a lifelong project that I only wrote on in the last 10 years. And it's important to me because it's a three-generational World War II story set in Java, the Netherlands, and America. So it mirrors a lot of my family's journey, and it mirrors a lot of my yearning as a child to know my father's true story. Because in this novel, one of the characters survives the other Holocaust, Japanese concentration camps in World War II in Indonesia, and all civilians were put into camps. And so I grew up hearing, it's too horrible to talk about, it's too much, I don't want to tell you, and yet I really wanted to know his story. And so my father was born in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and as growing up, he was a dad who lost his temper. He was a dad who was very, very caring. He was a dad who was very controlling, always had to know exactly where each family member was, and critical, and often very loving, very fun. So there were all these highs and lows. I knew, I could sense that there was a hole in his life, and I grew up in a family of storytellers. My mother talked about Nazi occupation in the Netherlands. My father talked only before and after the war. There was a gap. If we asked questions about a certain time in his life, he didn't answer. If one of us didn't finish a meal, he would lose his temper, and I would feel terribly upset, or a family member would feel terribly upset. And eventually I learned that starvation, very, very, very severe starvation, was part of his story, you know. So when he had a hard time with some of us not being a member of the Empty Plate Club, you know, he was experiencing and remembering starvation. Since he didn't answer questions except that his island home was paradise prior to World War II, that the way I heard it was rejection. Actually, he was just saying this is too much to tell to children. My father had a crooked nose. He told me it had been broken. My father had a bridge all his life of teeth, and he told me his teeth had been knocked out in the camps. And I remembered one time for Christmas I got him a certificate that showed I'd made a donation in his name to a food bank, and he was very touched. And he said, "You will never know the pain of starvation is so terrible." And he was very pleased with that gift. I felt closer to my mother too, you know, realizing that neither of them had help. You know, in the Vietnam generation, post-traumatic stress disorder was named for what it was, but they had to go through memories and triggers, and usually people who didn't want to hear their stories, you know, on their own. I grew up fascinated with the main Holocaust, the Jewish experience of 6 million people dying in World War II, and I didn't know why that fascination was so strong. And so my mother would explain. She would explain my father had nightmares when they were first married. She would explain that when she was first making meals, his question every single time was, "Is there more?" And she always learned to make plenty. I always knew I had to write it, and I put aside all other writing projects, and I always knew it would be a heck of a journey because it's so personal. So I invented a family who lives in 2004 who has a crisis with an adult child, the character Albie, who's close to death from addiction. And Luce, the other main character, always thought she'd be the one to fix her family, but it's actually her brother's doctor that gets everybody to speak. And it starts an unexpected journey of healing. And there were times I cried. One amazing part was those opportunities to interview survivors, and many, many spiritual moments. So for instance, right here at Mount Hermon, I met a woman who said, "Oh, my father-in-law went through that. He just started to talk about those years. I'll give you his phone number." And I said, "Great, let me give you my phone number too." And I went home and I thought of my experience of calling memoir writers and saying, "Will you talk to me?" And they would say no, because it was still just too much. And so I thought, I'll wait. And then his name was Fred Wilson, and he called me. And so I thought, wow, what a moment. You know, what a faith-filled moment that God's grace is always looking for us. And instantly, due to Indonesian hospitality concepts, he invited me to come stay. I was able to interview him. We learned that he would have been in some of the same concentration camps my father was in, although they never met. I wanted to channel a different story than my own family, so I imagined two brothers taken away from a women's and children's camp where they were already starving and being sent to a boys and men's camp, because the Japanese eventually looked at all males 10 years old and older as men. And I imagined them going as brothers. And I imagined the younger brother, the other main character in this novel, Jakob, I imagined that he thought a little bit, he arranged it, he imagined he had control. And so when I talked to Fred, it turned out he and his brother had left at the same time and were called to go to a boys and men's camp at the same time. And they were eventually, because the Japanese always moved people from these camps under terrible conditions, they were eventually reunited with their father for the rest of the war. And they were fortunate, you know, they all survived. But my own grandfather that I never knew did not survive. The Fred Wilson interview, what really impacted me was the wonder of seeing his journey of being ready to talk. So his church asked him and a German POW camp survivor if they would talk, and Fred had had that determination to never talk. So he went ahead and talked because he was very much a Christian and he really felt the Lord calling him to do that. And so he had everything organized and was writing his own memoir. So I had the chance to see the glow in him of when you face the fear of the past, that really it's wonderful. So he showed me a sweater that his mother had him unknit and knit all the time to keep the kids busy and out of trouble in the camps. He had a souvenir he had made for his mother in the camp years, all these things. And then my other experience was meeting Dutch Americans who are part of the Canadian-Dutch newspaper called De Krant, which only means the newspaper. I got to interview Lou and Yopi, and Lou is Indonesian, and he and all his town was imprisoned by the Japanese because none of the young people or young adults would sign up to join the Japanese army. And his conditions were especially deadly, and he described with tears in his eyes what it was like to sit with somebody for the meager dinner and all of a sudden have the boy next to you drop dead because his heart just couldn't take the starvation anymore. And he was in prison twice, so he came out of the camps. His mother helped him to heal with a special soup, and he was absolutely skeletal. Then he and both his father and grandfather were captured again, because one of the things we need to know about war is liberation is not usually true liberation. And so I take that symbolically as well, because I know, since I have recovering alcoholic characters, and I'm a recovering alcoholic myself since my teenage years, that the second you give up something, you're not immediately liberated. So the real life events of World War II ending in Indonesia was that the locals fought for independence, and everything erupted into chaos. So once again, Lou was in prison, and the freedom fighters were actually outside his area about to torch, they were beheading people. And he and his father and grandfather had just decided, they knew they would lose, but they had just decided they would fight when the freedom fighters came from them. And his mother and female relatives were locked into a convent, and the freedom fighters there were lighting fires around the edge, and just then the Gurkhas and the British liberators came. So Gurkhas were Indian British soldiers, and so a lot of those nick of time experiences. So I also have my nick of time experiences, and you know, how does God put us places? Because In 1973, Houston was the only place that had a 12-step program for young people. So I went to that program and started to stay straight and sober. Like most young alcoholics, I thought there was no reason for it. It was just an experiment. Of course, it turned out to be a very tough experiment because I wasn't used to dealing with life sober. I didn't tell my family the truth because I wanted to be perfect, and I thought my family message was, you must be perfect, and that they would feel ashamed of me. And so all of a sudden, I had an opportunity to let out feelings, and it was amazing. And one of the cool things that happened was when my husband and I got married, my husband had a very tame bachelor's party, and my dad loved all the jokes and all the camaraderie. And my mother always said that my father had a father-sized hole in his life, and he loved to be with men. And I had extreme loneliness from about age 6 to 15, and a long, long journey of trusting people. I was very secure as a little kid, and we lived in Iran for a while. We were so international. And we would go back and forth from Iran or Iran to the Netherlands, and I was a homing pigeon for my grandparents' dairy farm, and I called my grandparents Beppe and Pakke, and we were terribly close. And when we moved to the U.S. when I was 6 years old, you know, it started to dawn on me as a little kid, oh, I can't go back, you know, it's too far. And I was already a shy kid anyway, but there was a language barrier, so I know what it's like to go to first grade not speaking English yet. There was a blessing because I could write and read in Dutch already, so it made it easy to get my language and my English language. And so I started to live in a real fantasy world because I usually didn't have friendships anymore. I got into a very strong habit of just being lonely, feeling split inside, because intellectually I knew I was okay, and yet I felt deeply, deeply insecure and like somebody who couldn't make friends, who couldn't talk, who couldn't do the ordinary social things, although I probably looked to others like I could do those things. I had an opportunity to do peer counseling, and so that was great. You know, we got to be peer counselors to our new friends in the program I sobered up in. And I always knew I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I thought of myself as a doctor, and so I'm off to college locally because I'm kind of scared to leave home. And I'm discovering I hate biology and I don't like the idea of blood. So I started going towards being a counselor, and I was always advised not to. It was an era where half the world wanted to be a counselor, but I'd always get drawn back to it. And always back to all the education that I would need, because you have to have a master's degree. So I feel in the zone when I counsel people. I truly didn't realize that as I gravitated towards working with trauma, that it was because of the secondhand trauma in my life, the major trauma in my life from so many moves. I went to 7 different elementary schools, and then growing up with trauma. So looking up characteristics of children and grandchildren of World War II survivors, it became very meaningful. Like the characters in my story, I would rather be self-sufficient and just form a secure life and never be challenged, and be with the people that are easy to communicate with. And like the character in my story, I'm actually very tongue-tied if I'm with family and we have a significant conversation. I identified with Luce, the adult character who goes through a lot and also revisits her own childhood. She's always has a lump in her throat. She's always trying to communicate, and so a lot of the story is she finally going to say more about what she went through? And a lot of that will actually be in book 2. And a lot of the story is the world of what you assume when you're lonely, and how the relationships weren't as broken as she thought they were, but with the huge blocks of, like icy blocks of communication, you know, it just didn't happen. And then, you know, to have these characters, this family, they're called van der Veer, which means of the feather, as if they're blown around, actually step up to crises completely, and knowing that every family, and my real family, would do that. And yet, what a scary journey.